Hello, everyone. This is the Broad Statement Podcast. My name is Macey Taylor, or Uncle Bitch if you're nasty. I'm the host, producer, creator, researcher, I do everything for this show. So thank you so much for listening. Today, I'm going to be talking about grief. This year, I've experienced a lot of loss. I have to specify that I have a great life, I have a safe place to live, money in the bank, food in my fridge, and the best friends anyone could ever ask for. In a previous episode, Banned Books Part 1, I spoke about the death of a friend of mine. But unfortunately, that wasn't the only person on the list of people that I've lost. In a very short time, 7 people I know have died. I mean, it's not all bad. I keep reassuring myself with these various soothing, unanswerable questions like why and who's next. I keep trying to make sense of this chaos. I think about the time I dropped a stack of mirrors and I've concluded, yep, that was it. I've got bad luck for life and I just need to get used to it. While I won't get into specifics like names, identities, or the types of relationships that I had with them, the people who passed away all died for various reasons. The circumstances range from inexplicable sudden deaths, drug poisonings, a freak accident, long-term medical complications, and a murder. And yeah, that last one's confirmed, which is just fucking awful. To say I'm overwhelmed is the understatement of the century. Again, I've got a great life, but this is a lot. Both the frequency and variety of causes is upsetting me on a level that I did not think that I could reach. Right now, my coping mechanisms are all out of whack. It's like winning a fucked up fun bag every single day. Will I get Cool Ranch bereavement or flaming hot Griefitos? Who's to say? Some days I feel like nothing bad ever happened, and others I'm inconsolable from the moment that I wake up until I go to bed. As traumatic as this has all been, the losses I experienced have helped me actually overcome some stuff that I've been stuck on in therapy for years. I've come to realize that the only way to develop as a person is to admit that I have vulnerabilities. Something I hate to admit about myself is that I'm highly emotional and very, very sensitive. You'd never guess that if you saw me in person, because I have a wicked resting bitch face and a fiery temper. You might not even know how tender I am if you were an acquaintance of mine, as I tend to keep my innermost thoughts and feelings to myself. But I think I'm ready to try to be a little bit more open. As much as I'm disturbed by the randomness of everything that's happened, I also have comfort in my friends, and I'm able to take care of myself. I'm frazzled, but understand that I'm remarkably strong. I'm a crybaby bitch in private, but I walk around with a smile and a heart full of love, because life is too precious and short to allow pain to dictate how I'm going to live. Your deity of choice only chooses the strongest warriors for their toughest battles, and by George, I think I'll be regarded like Hercules after everything I've been through. With that said, considering death is on the forefront of my mind every day all day, I'd like to talk about grief, funerary practices, and cultural anthropology regarding death. If any of you are wondering what you can do to help, I've got something for you. How about you throw 2022 out of the fucking window for me? But if you can't do that, please just come to my gigs, listen to my show, and share my content with your friends. Let's start with the basics. What is grief, anyways? There are several different types of grief, but the one we are focusing on today is regarding death. Grief is the emotional response a person experiences when someone they know dies, and can be characterized with emotions such as despair, shock, confusion, anxiety, panic, anger, guilt, sorrow, and regret. The phenomenon of grief is fascinating because it's both universal and unique. Every person will grieve in their lifetime, but not everyone will grieve in the same way. It's neither linear nor finite. There's no step-by-step guide, a what to expect when you're grieving booklet, to outline what may or may not happen in someone's journey to healing. One person might feel sad for a moment. Another may fall into a lifelong depression. Others may feel sympathy for everyone around them, but never feel upset themselves. And, certain folks will be overjoyed knowing that someone else died. This is a highly complex and nuanced experience. But, no matter our differences, everyone wants their grief to be witnessed. Most people will do things like attend a funeral, call a friend, or attend therapy to deal with their feelings. Some will do maladaptive things like commit crimes, abuse drugs and alcohol, or engage in risky sex to take the edge off. And others, perhaps a certain someone with too much time on their hands, will record a podcast. All anyone wants is to be recognized, especially when we're hurting. Even if people can't rationalize how they act when they're upset, every single person on this planet wants to be acknowledged and have someone understand their pain. Everyone wants to be vindicated, but no one anticipates how their life will change when someone they know dies. Whether we like to admit it or not, the connections we have play a big role in our sense of self. The relationship you have with someone can shape how you view yourself, others around you, and the way you interact with your world. Death causes people to lose a source of validation and stability. No matter who the person was to you or how you feel about them, loss will make you redevelop your identity. It doesn't matter if you lost the love of your life or the only person you can shit-talk with your entire family. There are many variables in relationships, and the relationship you have with a deceased person will necessitate change in your life and the lives of everyone around you. Even though your circumstances are simultaneously collective and individual, you will be forced to figure out how to move on. And worst of all, death is usually a surprise. We all like to believe we will die of old age, surrounded by our children, grandchildren, spouse, and friends after living the life we wanted. But that's rarely how it goes, which makes everything all the more discombobulating. We strive to make sense of our world, but grief and loss are inconsistent and random. Many have attempted to conceptualize the overwhelming emotional experience of loss with a specific behavioral sciences model called the 5 stages of grief. The 5 stages of grief, or the Kubler-Ross model, was introduced by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her 1969 book On Death and Dying, and was inspired by her work with terminally ill patients. Kubler-Ross based her findings on people who were dying rather than those who were grieving, although she later applied it to grieving friends and family members of her patients as well. The 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Kubler-Ross has noted that these stages aren't linear or predictable, and acknowledged the way she wrote her findings was greatly misunderstood. For a long time, people thought that the 5 stages of grief had to be done in the exact order they were written, but that's not true at all. Someone can go through any emotion when experiencing a loss, and there is no guideline to how it happens. Kubler-Ross's research was on how people cope with grief, and not as reflections on how everyone grieves. Regardless of the interpretation, the 5 stages of grief is infamous. In this context, what does each stage of grief look like? Everyone knows what these emotions feel like, but what would someone experiencing them do or say? I'm going to use a profoundly stupid anecdote as an example to lighten the mood. And I use the word lighten in quotation marks, because I find this story very funny, but I also have a blacker-than-black sense of humor. And if you want to hear this story, you need to decide right fucking now. You're either on this ride or not, so buckle up or get the fuck out of here. If you don't want to listen to this, this is your time to skip ahead. For those of you who are not complete pussies, this is a story about a childhood trauma that I have from when I was attacked by wasps. When I was 9 years old, my dog and I were playing in a creek near my house, and we had to get up a slope to go back home. We were sprinting straight uphill like the cutest momos you've ever seen. I distinctly recall that I was waving my stupid little arms in the air, yelling at my dog about the gay old time we were having. But on the way up, my foot kicked a weird-looking gopher hole. You see, that was a very hot, very dry summer. The insects were out of control, especially the wasps. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but a nest had been formed inside the gopher hole I kicked. Well, it turns out, the little waspies, they don't like that very much. When I heard humming getting louder and louder, and saw swarms of irate wasps coming my way, I didn't realize the world of pain I was about to be in. I was such an idiot that there was a moment where I thought, do they want to play? How will we play with all these bugs, Charlie? Denial is how a person feels when they reject pain. This happens because the reality of the loss and tragedy doesn't feel real yet. Unfortunately, I found out the hard way that not all those who find out fucked around. I had zero idea there was a nest in that gopher hole, okay? I didn't know I was gonna kick it. But they didn't care, did they? I was an asshole, and the wasps were on a kamikaze mission. When I was being stung all over my body, I started crying and screaming because what the fuck else was I supposed to do? My body was burning from stings and rage. I was asking myself questions like, why? And why Charlie? And what did I do to deserve this? Anger is characterized by antagonism towards someone or something you feel has done you wrong. This emotion can make someone feel powerful when they are otherwise powerless. It can be easier to be angry than allow yourself to be vulnerable or sad. I was in pure agony when I was being ruthlessly attacked and watching my dog howl with pain. I very much wanted my predicament to end, so I started to negotiate with myself out of sheer despair. I started yelling something along the lines of, I swear to God, I'll start going to church. I'll become religious. Anything to make this stop. Bargaining is the hope that you can avoid the feelings of grief. The goal of bargaining isn't to actually change what's happening, but to regain control of your situation. Realistically, it's flaccid anger and is a desperate, miserable process. God never answered my cries for help because the wasps kept coming and coming. My mom came to find me because she heard me shrieking like a banshee. She had to drag my ass and our dog out of the ravine while we were still being ravaged. She took me to the hospital as a precautionary measure, and ultimately, I didn't need treatment because of my injuries, but being stung that many times fucked me up for life. The trauma of the attack was the catalyst for a dormant autoimmune disease to come to life. My body and my mind were stressed right the fuck out. Due to genetics, there is a chance I could have developed symptoms down the line. But had this really traumatic thing never happened, I think I would have had a greater chance of living normally. After this experience, I became anxious, sad, had nightmares, and had a low mood for a few weeks. And I especially felt bad once the autoimmune disorder kicked in. I went from living la vida loca to a shell of a child. Depression is the sadness, emptiness, and/or hopelessness that occurs when you understand your loss. This can be a prolonged stage that lasts weeks, months, or years. Thankfully, I was able to get medical treatment for my chronic disease and depression, but I still struggle with flare-ups as an adult, which can be painful and persistent. No matter how you interpret the story, it does have a happy ending. As hard as things can be sometimes, I've recovered. I have the ability to laugh at myself. I am absolutely bona fide, 1000% terrified of wasps, but that's hilarious to me. To this day, I do wonderfully idiotic things if one of them gets too close to me. In the last 5 years, I have jumped out of a moving vehicle more than one time because one flew into an open window. I have bolted out of my own home because a wasp got inside. No keys, no wallet, no shoes, and sometimes no pants. I will sprint like Sha'Carri Richardson down the street, doing her signature point as I wail, "Wasp!" You know those assholes who put thick tires on their bikes? Well, the way those tires sound when they're on pavement is a lot like a swarm of wasps coming to fuck your shit up. Whenever someone rides one of those suckers by me, I tense up, shake, and one time I fainted. And by my standards, those are all very silly things for me to do. Even though I act like a pansy at 30 years old, I know I gained resilience from my god-awful experience. I learned I can have something very bad happen to me, but wind up okay. And that brings us to acceptance. Acceptance is the feeling a person has when they understand the inevitable nature of their loss. It means you embrace the present, both good and bad, in order to shape the future. My story aside, Here are some other examples of what these emotions can look like for someone who's grieving. Someone in denial may busy themselves excessively, pretend their loved one is away on a trip and coming back, minimize theirs and others' relationship with the deceased, speak about the deceased person in present tense, and self-medicate with alcohol, drugs, or food. Someone who's angry may lash out, blame people around them for the death, become suddenly angered at inanimate objects, strangers, friends, or family members, or even life itself. They may feel angry with the person who died and resent them for causing their pain. They might yell, argue with, and become sarcastic towards everybody else around them. Someone who's bargaining may ruminate over what could have been done differently, worry and overthink their circumstances, judge themselves and others, make comparisons to other people's circumstances, try to predict the future, assume the worst, develop rituals like hand-washing, counting things, or other abnormal behaviors with the belief that they can prevent someone else's death, and might wish or pray for their circumstances to be reversed. They may also make promises to be a better person, negotiate with a higher power, offer help to others that they can't provide in order to deal with the guilt of their loss, or make donations. Someone who's depressed will exhibit the classic signs of depression, but have their feelings tailored to the loss of their loved one. They might stop going places they would go with the deceased, feel hopeless about the future, become disconnected from everyone around them, sleep excessively, live in a fog, and stop spending time with their loved ones, or skip work or become non-functional. Sometimes, if depression is prolonged, it can turn into complicated grief. The signs and symptoms of complicated grief are intense sorrow and pain, rumination over the loss, focusing on nothing except the loss, either extreme focus or extreme avoidance of reminders of the loss, intense and persistent longing for the deceased, cynicism, believing life has no meaning or purpose, loss of trust in others, and the inability to enjoy life or think back on positive experiences with the deceased. Someone who's accepted their loss will still feel the pains of the negative emotions associated with grieving, but understand these feelings are natural and temporary. They could have a renewed enjoyment of life, gain insight on their present circumstances, reflect on good memories, regain a sense of responsibility for themselves, and have a deeper appreciation of life. Acceptance can also cause someone to have more intimate and emotionally rich relationships with others. Once again, there's no particular order for any of these stages. Everyone will process their emotions in their own way. Something I think a lot of people forget is that these very strong, overwhelming emotions will have a huge effect on our body too. Research to date suggests that bereavement is associated with increased cortisol, aka activation of your fight or flight response. You may have insomnia or sleep excessively, your immune system doesn't work as well, the cells responsible for inflammation go berserker, you have an increased risk of blood clots, and your heart rate and blood pressure can change dramatically. The inflammatory response is particularly concerning with grief because strong emotional responses trigger and worsen inflammation. I know, inflammation is one of those phrases people use but don't actually know what it means, similar to celiac disease, I'm allergic, or I love you. But even if you don't really understand the concept of inflammation, it is majorly important when it comes to grief. Remember how getting my ass whooped by insects caused me to develop an autoimmune disease? I didn't say that as a hypothetical. It's a fact. I could have lived my entire life without a chronic illness, but the emotional trauma from being attacked made my inflammatory cytokine proteins see my healthy cells and decide, not on my fucking watch. Here is the most relatable example that I can think of that will make you understand what happens to your immune system during emotional turmoil. Have you ever been having just a really, really fucking bad day, then you yelled at your spouse or a friend because they were just in the way? Under normal circumstances, you have a supportive, loving thing going on with this other person, but on this particular day, you were already at your breaking point, so you took your anger out on someone you love. They didn't start the fire, but got burned anyways. That is a very oversimplified explanation of what happens when your immune system gets overwhelmed. To put it in layperson's terms, your immune system is the thing that protects you from illnesses, and inflammation is the tool your immune system uses to keep your body healthy. Under normal conditions, inflammation occurs when your immune system is trying to destroy things like bacteria, toxins, but can also happen when tissues become damaged due to injuries or illnesses. But under abnormal conditions, like the emotional stress of grief, the cells responsible for inflammation are on high alert. When someone is under a tremendous amount of emotional stress, the body can do irrational things trying to defend itself. Things like mistake healthy cells for bad ones. In 2018, research was done on how spousal bereavement is associated with pronounced cytokine production and lower heart rate variability. The focus group of the research was people who recently lost their spouse. Recently, as in within the last 3 months. The researchers conducted interviews with just under 100 people whose spouses had recently died and also took samples of their blood. The blood samples of those who were experiencing elevated grief, including feeling like life had lost its meaning, had inflammation levels 17% higher than those who didn't feel that way. And the top 1/3 of the grieving group had levels nearly 54% higher than the bottom 1/3. The lead study author, Chris Fajundes, an assistant professor of psychological sciences at Rice University, said the following about the psychological response to depression and grief. Previous research has shown that inflammation contributes to almost every disease in older adulthood. We also know that depression is linked to higher levels of inflammation, and those who lose a spouse are at considerably higher risk of major depression, heart attack, stroke, and premature mortality. This is the first study to confirm that grief, regardless of people's levels of depressive symptoms, can promote inflammation, which in turn can cause negative health outcomes. There you have it, folks. Regardless of if you got attacked by wasps, or someone you loved died, your body is keeping the score, and babe, you're not winning. Very unfair of the body to do, in my humble, grief-stricken, chronically diseased opinion. Come on, aren't we supposed to be on the same team here? Why are you beating me up, body? We're the same fucking person. Whether you're in the throes of sorrow or your inflammatory system is in overdrive, grief is a roller coaster of feelings and sensations. Why? One thing that might make your psychological and physiological turbulence better is a ceremony to commemorate the worst days of your life. Better yet, it should be in front of all of your family members and friends. Let's talk about funerals. Every culture has their own funerary practices. Every religion, too. I've been to many in my lifetime, and each one was similar, albeit subjective. In North America, the template used for most funerals comes from Christianity. If your family hosts a funeral, there will typically be a visitation, funeral, and then a burial service. The visitation is also known as a wake. It's common for the visitation to be held at a funeral home, but can also happen at a personal residence. The deceased might be displayed in a casket, but could also be in an urn if they've already been cremated. Sometimes the casket's open, and other times it's closed. Really just depends on the physical state of the deceased or the wishes of the family. The deceased is dressed in their favorite clothes and may be adorned with jewelry and have their favorite items placed inside of the casket. Visitors may bring gifts, either for the deceased or their family. They are commonly asked to sign a book. Pictures might be displayed, and stories shared amongst those who have gathered. The funeral occurs once the descendant is transported from the funeral home or residence to a church in a hearse. This can happen a couple days after the wake. Again, it really depends on what the family wants to do. Funerary customs vary from culture to culture, but a common denominator in all services is there is someone who leads the ceremony. This is done by an officiant who is responsible for structuring and leading the service. Anyone can do this, but it's advantageous to hire someone who's a professional. Duties of the funerary officiant include a eulogy, religious prayers or customs, invites attendees to speak, and tries to ensure everything runs smoothly. After the funeral, the coffin may be taken directly to a cemetery for burial. If the deceased person is to be cremated, the procession may proceed to the crematorium. Sometimes a burial service happens immediately, and other times it will have to happen at a later date. Living in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, I can confirm it is particularly challenging to attend a burial service in February when it's -50 and snowing sideways. There are many variances in customs depending on what the deceased did for a living, their religious views, their personality, or what the family would like to do. Some families will host a reception afterwards where attendees can eat, drink, and spend time with one another. Each reception is a little different, and paying respects to the deceased is contingent on what they were like personally. I've been to funeral receptions where everyone awkwardly munched on cucumber sandwiches for 10 minutes and then left, which is fine and dandy, because sometimes you don't need more than that. At another one, everyone was beside themselves. Even I was crying, and I seriously do not do that in front of other people. The gathering was the epitome of anguish, and I hope I never feel that badly in front of anyone ever again. My all-time favorite funerary reception I ever attended was when the whole lot of us got tore up from the floor up. Everyone, all of the deceased's relatives, friends, and myself were swinging from the rafters by dinner time. That was the best, worst day of my life. The intention of getting that intoxicated was to kill our demons, but instead, they knocked back our poison and demanded more. It's the only time I've done cocaine, had sex, and watched the sunrise at a funeral. What can I say? I bring chaotic, sexy energy everywhere I go, and the hellish pits of despair are no exception. A stand-up comedian named Doug Stanhope said it best. There's times to be dainty, and then there's times to be a pig. Nevertheless, when you're at a funeral, there's an essence of connection and closure. The purpose of a funeral is to say goodbye to the deceased and contribute to the community who knew them in their lifetime. Like I mentioned earlier, each culture has their own funerary practices. Here are some of the examples of practices that I've found from around the globe. A sky burial is common in Tibet amongst Buddhists who believe in the value of sending their loved ones' souls towards heaven. In this ritual, bodies are left outside, often cut into pieces, for birds or other animals to devour. This serves the dual purpose of eliminating the now empty vessel of the body and allowing the soul to depart, while also embracing the circle of life and giving sustenance to animals. Dancing with the Dead best describes a burial tradition in Madagascar. The Malagasy people open the tombs of their dead every few years and rewrap them in fresh burial clothes. Each time the dead get fresh wrappings, they also get a fresh dance near the tomb while music plays all around. This ritual, translated as the turning of the bones, is meant to speed up decomposition and push the spirit of the dead towards the afterlife. Many cultures, especially in Nordic countries, have embraced water in their rituals of choice for the dead, from laying coffins atop cliffs face towards the water to actually using the water as a burial ground. Some set bodies adrift in death ships, either along a river or sent out into the ocean, giving the bodies back to the gods, or places most valued by the people of the area. One Zoroastrian tradition, an ancient pre-Islamic religion of Iran that survives in isolated areas, requires vultures for its burial ritual. In this culture, a dead body is believed to defile everything it touches, including the ground and fire, and raising a corpse up to the sky for vultures to devour was historically the only option. Bull's urine is used to clean the body before tools, which are later destroyed, are used to cut off the clothing. The corpse is then placed atop a tower of silence, out of the way of the living who could be tainted by it. In South Korea, the ashes of the deceased are turned into beads, and these beads have a little bit of a shine to them and come in a wide variety of colors, from pink or black to turquoise. Placed inside glass vases or even open in dishes, the beads can then take center stage inside a home, a more decorative choice than a conventional urn. In the Philippines, the Tingguian people dress the deceased in the fanciest of clothes and sit the body on a chair, often placing a lit cigarette on the lips, while the Benguet people blindfold their dead before placing them in chairs at the entrance of the home. The Sagada region features coffins hung from cliffs, bringing the souls of the dead closer to heaven, while people in the Cavite often entomb the deceased vertically in a hollowed-out tree chosen by the person before death. And I don't know if you've noticed, but pretty much all of these practices are driven by religion. Depending on your religion, there are certain things that you either have to do or cannot do when someone dies. In Islamic customs, the funeral and burial happen as soon as possible in order to free the soul from the body. The departed are washed by adult members of the family, men by men and women by women. Then, they are ceremonially wrapped in white cloth and buried within 3 days of the time of death. It's a process that includes an odd number of washings and a specific number of steps, dictating which body part is washed and in what order. Because of the wrapping, the washing, and the desire to bury the dead as soon as possible, Muslim funerals generally don't have a viewing, though this may be done by certain members of the community directly after the body is wrapped. Cremation is discouraged due to the Islamic belief in resurrection of the physical body. Muslim burials place the body facing Mecca, or towards the northeast in North America. At the graveside service, the first surah from the Quran is read, followed by the prayers of those present. Then, 3 fistfuls of dirt are thrown by the attendees. I'm going to note that because of the cultural associations of grieving females wailing at funerals, women are, for the most part, typically not involved in the funeral procession. And to end it all, there's a specific process of weeping, which may be observed for no more than 3 days. Ain't nobody got time for that, apparently. In Jewish customs, a funeral usually takes place within 1 day following the date of a death, but in modern times, that time frame has changed to allow mourners to travel, and also for appropriate arrangements to be made. These are solemn and reflective services, followed by a gathering at the mourner's home, which marks the beginning of Shiva. Shiva occurs after the first 7 days following a funeral, and the mourners generally stay at home and receive guests to help them pray and reflect upon their loss. Judaism allows for a deep mourning period during which celebration of life and personal beautification of yourself and your surroundings are considered distractions from the religious healing process. The funeral is a private time for the family, and the religion provides there is no public viewing of the body. The casket is typically a plain wooden box and closed at the funerary service. A rabbi provides a short, reflective, and solemn eulogy. At the graveside of a Jewish funeral, it is a common tradition, along with a sign of respect and love to the deceased, for the mourners and friends to participate in the actual burial. Today, many people place a few shovels of soil onto the casket to symbolically follow this tradition. During a Hindu ceremony, the Hindu funeral rites take the form of chants and mantras, which are overseen by an officiant, usually a Hindu priest or the eldest son of the bereaved. They will gather the family and friends and lead them in the various Hindu death rituals, which can include washing the body with ghee, honey, milk, and yogurt, placing essential oils on the head of the deceased, turmeric for females, sandalwood for males, placing the palms in a position of prayer and tying the big toes together, placing a garland of flowers and rice balls around their loved ones, putting a lamp near the head, or sprinkling water on the body. Traditionally, the deceased is wrapped in a white sheet. However, in modern times, they can wear dress clothes. In this faith, the body is merely a vessel in this lifetime and doesn't need to be preserved. Typically, Hindu adults are cremated and children will be buried. The adults will be cremated usually within 24 hours after the funeral. As well, children can be buried because they are considered to be pure. In many African cultures, death is recognized with a rite of passage, which prepares the spirit of the deceased on their journey to the next realm. This ritual ensures the deceased is properly put to rest. The person who has died is at peace, and they can move along to their ancestors. This belief comes from a common African concept that life and death are on a continuum of existence, with death seen as just another state of being. In death, the whole person still exists, but now inhabits the spirit world, and they can be reincarnated into several people. If the deceased is not buried correctly, or a person lived a life of dishonor, their ghost can remain as part of the world of the living and wander around and cause harm. African death rituals begin by preparing the home soon after a person dies and receiving people who come to pay their respects to the dead. Some of these home rituals often include turning all pictures to face the wall and covering all mirrors, windows, and reflective surfaces so the dead can't view themselves. In South Africa, the windows are smeared with ashes. Removing the bed from the deceased person's bedroom. Holding a vigil in the home where the whole community comes to pay respect and offer condolences to the family. Death rituals for removing the body from the house to take to a morgue or the burial site are meant to confuse the dead so that they can't find their way back home or into the house too soon. Some of these customs include taking the deceased out of the house through a hole in the wall instead of a door and sealing the hole so they can't find their way back in. This symbolizes that they are now a part of their ancestral community. The dead might be taken out feet first so he's facing away from the location of the house. They could be walked along a zigzag path to the burial site to confuse them so that they can't go back home. And the relatives and loved ones of the deceased might throw obstacles such as thorns, branches, or other barriers on the path, again to make it more difficult for them to find their way back. The deceased is buried as quickly as possible to be returned with their ancestors. At the burial ceremony, those present can be asked to request a favor for the family or protection from trouble for the deceased. There may also be a ritualistic killing of an ox or cow so the animal can accompany the dead to the land of their ancestors and act as a protector to the living. In Asia, ceremonies vary depending on where the family's from. Like, for example, Korean funerals vary widely depending on the economic status and religious preferences of the person whose life is being honored. In Japanese funerals, cremation is generally chosen, and the memorial service follows Buddhist or Shinto customs depending on the family's religious preferences. Most Japanese homes maintain Buddhist altars and shrines. When a death occurs, the shrine is closed and covered with a white paper to keep out the impure spirits of the dead. A small table decorated with flowers, incense, and a candle may be placed next to the deceased's bed. An encoffining ritual is performed where a mortician dresses and prepares the body to be placed in a coffin. While this ritual isn't performed as often as it once was, even in modern times, a deceased female is dressed in a white kimono and a deceased male is dressed in a suit or a kimono. Oh boy, many of these customs go back eons, but there are some modern funeral types worth mentioning. A very common one is a celebration of life. It's a contemporary alternative to a traditional funeral. The event focuses on the life of the deceased person instead of their death. These ceremonies can be held at homes, restaurants, parks, pubs, or realistically anywhere based on the interests of the deceased. A jazz funeral, which originated out of New Orleans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is a traditionally African American burial ceremony and celebration of life. This event involves a parading funeral procession accompanied by brass band playing hymns and jazz music. I mean, God, there are countless funerary practices all across our earth, and as much as I would like to cover them all, it's impossible for me to do so. I think it's pretty clear that all of these customs have observable trends. The deceased is dressed and adorned in fancy clothing. Loved ones travel to mourn with the immediate family members of the deceased. There is a ceremony involving prayers, stories, and a burial or cremation. Sure, those are the actions that we take when we grieve, but I'm curious to know how these behaviors influence historical and modern culture. Us human beings, we are silly little guys who gain most of our comfort from things that can be irrational. I said it earlier, and I'll say it again. We are merely trying to make sense of our lives. We like to do this thing called believing, and if the band journey is right, we should neither stop nor give up the feeling. The definition of belief is an acceptance that a statement is true or that something exists, or the trust, faith, or confidence in someone or something. When it comes to beliefs, we don't have to be right, we don't have to have proof, we don't need to have a jury of our peers decide on our behalf. We simply need to feel confident our rituals will help us out. But how do we feel assured when it comes to something as enigmatic as death? Do our behaviors and feelings about death shape our practices? And how far back can we trace these customs? To close this episode, I'm going to dive into cultural anthropology. Before I yammer on, I'm going to define it. I seriously didn't even really understand what the term meant until this week, and I figure I may as well give my audience an idea of what I'm talking about. Cultural anthropology is the study of how people who share a common cultural system organize and shape the physical and social world around them, and are in turn shaped by those ideas, behaviors, and physical environments. Some examples are learning how language is learned and shared between cultures via linguistics, or discovering the meanings of what people have left behind through archaeology. In the paper Death Ritual: Anthropological Perspectives, Milton Cohen applies anthropological research to the process of death and dying. In his introduction, Milton states, "In all societies, when a person dies, family, friends, and neighbors respond in structured, patterned ways to the death. Cultural guidelines determine the treatment and disposal of the body and prescribe a period of mourning for close relatives. Death ritual, like much of human behavior, is an expression of a cultural blueprint of attitudes, values, and ideas passed down by parents and their parents, which an individual learns as a member of society. The analysis of mortuary practices provides rich data on the behavior of kin and community. It leads to people's notions of gods, souls, witches, spirits, and afterworlds. It promises access to their belief and value systems, to their concepts of the social and moral worlds. It informs that rituals have consequences for both the individual and society." In this paper, Milton references two major works, Rites of Passage by Arnold van Gennep and Collective Representations of Death, an essay by Robert Hertz. I will provide a source to Milton's paper in my show notes. However, I was unable to find the other resources for the referenced works. If I ever do access them, I will provide an update and edit this episode's show notes. But on to the juicy stuff. What exactly is a ritual? A ritual is a behavior which is personal and private, and is used to reduce anxiety, prepares someone to act, and/or coordinates the preparation for action amongst several individuals. A ritual generally requires a sacred context, and behavior is ritualistic if it's habitual, socially sanctioned, or symbolic without any practical consideration. Some examples of rituals people use today are saying a prayer for a sick relative or burning sage to cleanse your home. There's no way of confirming if a prayer will be heard or answered. The person praying definitely wants good things for their sick relative. However, the prayer will also provide momentary comfort for the person saying it too. As for burning sage, do I 100% think the bad juju will leave my house like the bad guess that it is? Yes, and even if it doesn't do anything except make my home smell like burnt herbs, the act is driven by my beliefs, and that's good enough for me. Ritualization refers to the performance of prescribed actions with the expectation that the behavior will express and amend social relationships and to help secure mystical blessing, purification, protection, and prosperity. All cultures share trends on how and why rituals are performed when someone dies, and these ceremonial practices go way back. Death rituals are at least as old as our Neanderthal predecessors who lived in Europe and the Middle East, from 100,000 to 110,000 years ago, and may even reach back to Peking Man, almost 500,000 years. Neanderthals buried their dead in caves, depositing the body in the earth with great care. The legs were usually flexed or contracted tightly against the body, and the head was frequently pillowed on the arm. Graveside goods were often placed with the deceased. A child's body was surrounded by a circle of ibex horns. A young man was buried with a hand axe, a flint scraper, and an assortment of animal bones. An old man was buried with an entire bison leg, tools, and lumps of red ochre. Burial with tools may have been related to the belief that the dead man required these implements for his journey to the other world. The Cro-Magnon, the successors to the Neanderthal, occupied southern Europe and the Mediterranean from about 10,000 to 40,000 years ago, and buried their dead in a similar fashion to the Neanderthals. However, the implements found with the Cro-Magnon bodies were manufactured from human bone. Shallow cups were made from human skulls, human teeth were pierced, threading on a cord, and incised with ornamental designs. These objects may have been used in a magical ritual to control, secure the goodwill of, or to acquire the virtues of the departed. There is a distinct belief in all walks of life that death is a transition into a different way of living. The soul, like the body, is moving on to another form of existence. Often, the deceased are dressed in a specific way or given items to aid them in their journey to the afterlife. These rites of passage resemble those a person will experience in life, like at birth, puberty, or marriage. All rites of passage follow a standard pattern. A rite of separation is followed by a rite of transition and concludes with incorporation of a new role. And all of these themes mark every life cycle ceremony, although each is differentially emphasized depending on the group and the occasion. Specifically, the themes of death and rebirth occur periodically during the life of an individual. Physiological death occurs only once and is at the end of someone's life. Yet socially, a person can die many times, usually on the occasion when they undergo a transition from one social station to another. One approach to the study of ritual emphasizes the social and psychological functions of behavior. To Hertz, death ritual offers a respite, a breathing spell, time for the society and the individual to accommodate a dramatic change. Physical death does not, all at once, convince people that a person has died. The images and memory of this person exist, his connections to society are too strong to sever in the moment, and the acknowledgement of this person's loss comes very slowly. Death not only involves the extinction of the physical body, but also the blotting of a social identity. Rituals are the collective response to this attack. In effect, society looks death squarely in the eye and reaffirms its own will and resolve. Life will go on, irrespective of the loss of an individual. In Van Gennep's view, the rites of passage prepare the individual to step into a new social status, ready to assume new social responsibilities. Further, they focus attention on this change in social identity. The person has taken on a new social personality and must be treated in a manner appropriate for their new status. In primitive society, ordinary human events, such as death, marriage, or puberty, are rendered extraordinary and sacramental. These rituals and rites are more like an art form. Around them cluster the aesthetic creations of primitive society, the masks, poems, songs, and the dance, the quintessential rhythm of life and culture. In the performance of these ceremonies, man raises himself above the purely biological and confirms his humanity and the cultural character of human existence. Mortuary rites serve private and personal functions as well as social ones. As passage rites, they support the individual as they accomplish a transition and move through uncharted waters. A mourning period allows the bereaved to readjust personally and to contemplate a future without the physical presence of the dead person. Ritual dramas allow the person to maintain integrity of self while taking on a new social identity. But sadly, in modern times, we have moved away from death rituals and more into cookie-cutter ceremonies for death. And some observers identify religion in modern society with de-ritualization. These practices are less important in our world because relationships are so distinctive, played out in different physical surroundings with different sets of parameters. In traditional societies, individuals were incorporated into a community. You were a single person who contributed to a whole, and your role in your community was valuable. Ceremonial participation taught and reminded the individual of the responsibilities they held within their communities. So if ritual is less important in modern society, it's because of the availability of alternative channels of access to new social positions. Today, an individual moves ahead by gaining credentials, by meeting universal criteria set by schools and colleges, and by birth, marriage, and death registries. Everything is tailored to our individual preferences, which is causing our beliefs and behaviors to transform. Now, an individual needs to prove themselves in order to be valued. People are no longer embraced by a group or given responsibilities in order to gain a sense of purpose or belonging within their communities. In modern society, individuals have to give themselves the importance and support of an entire community, which is fucked up. As well, humans are moving away from religious models. We have scientific advancements and all the knowledge known to man in our pockets. We can't rely solely on our communities or families to teach us what we need to believe. People really are more isolated than ever, especially when it comes to death. On a whole, ceremonies involving the individual have declined in importance in modern life. Birth, naming, and puberty, when they are celebrated, do not command the same energy and commitments that they once did. Marriage and death, however, continue to summon ritual participation, but the attendance and dedication to these events has drastically decreased. Although we continue to fulfill our obligations when death strikes, our involvement is short-lived unless we are actually mourning. When the funeral service is over, the ritual support ends, and the bereaved are left to their private agonies. While we are not indifferent to death, we simply don't invest ourselves into mourning as much as we did in the past. Well, I think this is it. Episode 7 of the Broad Statement Podcast is about to perish. Before I go, there's a couple of things that I want to cover. First of all, if you are grieving, or know someone who is, and feel particularly down, I've listed some resources for you in the show notes, and will also say them here. If you feel suicidal in Canada, you can call 1-833-456-4566. In Calgary, you can call the Distress Center at 403-266-4357. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, please call 911. There are also many websites with good resources and phone numbers for crisis lines across the country. I am bound by character restrictions and therefore can't list them all, but you can find them with a simple Google search. And if you are my friend, please feel free to reach out to me anytime you want. I don't care what the situation is. I will do my best to help you in any way that I can. I'll be the first to admit that sometimes I do put my cell phone on airplane mode during the day so that I don't get distracted. But the second that I just go back online, I will be there for you. And please do not let the fact that you don't know what the right words are or how to begin what you want to say stop you from saying what you need to say. You are important, people love you, and you have value. Second, I decided to add some bonus content to my Patreon. I used to have a very interesting job, and my duties at that job were doing body transport for places like funeral homes or from crime scenes. And no, I did not stutter. I, Macey Taylor, used to help people out by picking up their deceased relatives. There are many things I learned in the time I had this job, and I thought it would be neat to share some of the things that I learned with my listeners. I'll emphasize that I refuse to glorify the deaths of real people. I know that I'm a weirdo, but I'm not a fucking monster. Even though I find this area of life really fascinating, I know not everybody wants to hear about it. So what I want to talk about in this bonus episode is like some of the duties that I had in my role, neat facts about death and decomposition, and share some of the insights and life lessons I learned in the death industry. So if you're just dying to hear about it, you can go to my Patreon for this content. And third, I'm revamping my YouTube account and going to release my show on more platforms. I have to do all of this by myself, so please hold your horses. I am but one lady. I'm already working my tits off trying to put on a good show, so please have a little faith and patience in my ability to spin these motherfucking plates. I'm hoping to be able to upload more of my episodes onto other platforms, let's say by the end of this week. Oh, until then, thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in supporting me, you can find me on Patreon, Anchor, Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram. And to say that my content is a matter of life and death is a bit of a broad statement. Bye, everyone.